I think as we all know, it's a tremendously important conversation that we are about to have, and we are going to rely very heavily on each, and well, not every one of you, but in one way or another on all of you. So stay with us. It's unique, I think, in the last 18 months to put America as one of the very last, the United States of America, as one of the very last panels as opposed to the first, but I think it might be a sign of the times that we know when certain conversations begin, it's hard to stop, and so perhaps that's why we're situated where we are. Today's panel, I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I feel like I know all of you at this point, which has been tremendous. I have thoroughly enjoyed meeting people, but just for those of you who might have come in late, I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I'm the new head of the U.S. and the Americas program here at Chatham House and dean of the Queen Elizabeth II Academy for Leadership in International Affairs. It is a tremendous honor to be able to moderate today's panel on Can America Regain Its Balance? Quite a title. And we have a really, and I mean this really very sincerely, a very exciting and interesting and diverse panel. So it's an honor. I will only very briefly, in the best of the London Conference traditions, introduce them to you. I suspect many of them are well known, but if they aren't, please do read the biographies, because we have a really rich set of experiences here. To my immediate left, we have the Commissioner for International Affairs, the New York City Commissioner for International Affairs, Penny Abbey-Wardena, who I've only just met, but it's already been quite a wonderful few days, and I'm looking forward to your comments. Next to the Commissioner, we have Senator Jeff Flake, who I imagine is very well known to you. He is the United States Senator for Arizona, a Republican senator. He has been in the Senate 2013 to 2017. Before this, he was a member of Congress from 2001 to 2013. And to the senators left, we have Ambassador Tony Gardner, who was the United States Ambassador to the European Union 2014 to 2017, and dare I say, as a London resident, so I hope we have further access, and this is the beginning or continuation of a conversation. And on the far end, we have John Zogby, who is very well known for the Zogby poll, probably to many of you. And if you aren't aware of the poll, I would strongly encourage you to follow this. He is the founder and senior partner of Zogby Companies. So you can see we have a tremendous array of expertise here on a number of dimensions. So I'm very humbled. Thank you for joining us at Chatham House. And I apologize for any tough questions that come at you, but it's an important topic. As we've been talking about the United States throughout the course of the last few days, one of the conversations that has come up has certainly been about changes within the United States and what the implications are of what seems like a very divided, a very polarized country, a country in which the 3 Ds, dignity, decency, and decorum, aren't what we expect and what we have imagined them to be from the United States for many decades. And I think one of the big questions for many people in Europe is, is this going to last? Is this a new state of affairs? And if it is, what do we do? Is this just something that's a temporary blip that has more to do with a particular leader and a style of leadership? Or is there something that's fundamentally changing within the United States, in America, with respect to other countries? That means that this is really, we're in it for the long run, and that Europe and the rest of the world need to rethink and readjust to a new America. And what I'd like to do, before I ask, I have very specific things I'd like to actually ask each one of you before we turn it to the audience. And I am going to come to the audience very quickly, I think, given the topic on hand that's important to do. But let me very quickly give you about 90 seconds to just weigh in on this broader question. Is this a new America? And for those of us who are based in Europe and outside of the United States, are we really looking at a very long-term change, and we need to get on board that and renegotiate and rethink how we engage with the United States? Senator Flake, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I think we're in a new day now. You mentioned I was in the Congress for 12 years, and it strikes me whenever I go and give a tour of the Capitol late at night for family or friends, and I was doing it the other night, and people always ask when you get to the House chamber, which everybody knows from the State of the Union address, And people say, well, where was your seat? And I tell them there's no assigned seating, but I would tell them where groups of people typically sat. And I would also point out in tours years ago, the Blue Dog Coalition, the centrist Democrats, would sit as a group near the center aisle, figuratively, literally. And when I was there the other night, I realized I can count only 2 Blue Dog Democrats left there. And similarly on the right, very few centrist Republicans. And you saw that reflected in the vote the House took yesterday, rejecting an immigration proposal and punting on the next one. And we see that in the Senate, just very few crossover votes. And so I think what it does mean is, regardless of how elections come, in the midterms and the next one, you're going to see a lot more herky-jerky back and forth because it is so polarized. And that's difficult, and I think our allies are going to have to adjust to that. It has traditionally been the case, and still is somewhat, but less so, that the Senate, with 6-year terms, particularly on foreign policy, played a much more evening out role. You see beyond the next hill. 2/3 of the body isn't up for re-election. And the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, looking more at strategy and what you do with foreign policy and military force and soft power, and you see less of that. And I think that our allies and those outside of the country are going to have to adjust to that.
To the Commissioner, are we in this for the long run?
We are, and I think the answer is yes. And I think that there has been a lot of opportunity in that. I will say, as the Trump administration over the last year and a half, and as the federal government has abdicated its role on a number of issues, whether it's climate change, the global compact on migration, what most Americans didn't appreciate, and I think our international counterparts, is the power of cities and states within our system. And so right now, I am representing New York City. I'm also representing the communities that make up New York City. And what we have seen is people taking action. There is a lot of polarization, but rather than letting that become something that handicaps us, this is an opportunity for citizens to take action. And how are we showing up in this larger conversation? So I think that this could be a very good thing in terms of communities participating in very important conversations that are important to the transatlantic relationship.
Great. So we have the opportunities side of the risk and opportunities Chatham House report. We should add you to that. John, are we in this? Do we need to readjust? Is this is going to go on for a long?
That's exactly the right word, readjustment. This is not new. We've had our cultural collisions, and they have reared their ugly heads before. And we've had our party realignments as well. We have both going on at the same time, and it's not working. And at the same time that we need political parties and that kind of direction, what's happening is that the parties are shifting to their fringes and leaving a huge middle out of play. I happen to be an optimist in the room, and I won't give you all the details now. What makes me hopeful are millennials and Gen Z, who, to put it bluntly, are just not steeped in this kind of junk and will build entirely new frameworks. That I'm very positive about. In the meantime, to use a phrase, we're in a period of creative destruction, and my biggest fear only is that in the short term, that destruction moves a whole lot faster than its substitution does to replace it.
Ambassador Gardner, you have a unique perspective, which I think is shared with many people in the audience, in the sense of having been London-based for a very long time and looking at America from within, but also from the outside. And then, of course, as in your role as ambassador to the EU. So are we in this for the long run?
I think it's more than a blip, for sure. And the reason I think it's very unique, what we're living through today, is not so much of change of policies. We've been through extreme swings before. But what's unique is that the attacks that we're seeing on our institutions, our media, our judiciary, the use of certain phrases like alternative facts, which kind of indicate the new world we're in, is something which is new and troubling, and particularly troubling because we see, with a few exceptions of which Senator Flake is one great example, in general we're seeing very little pushback, or very few people standing up and saying these things are destructive of our institutions, of our Constitution. I am hopeful, though, that although this is significant, not just a blip, that we're seeing civil society becoming very active. We're seeing our institutions acting as they were designed to act and exerting a control on executive power. So while I think it's more than a blip, I think that we will revert to the mean, and I think this new the young who will be voting are sincerely troubled by some of the things that are occurring.
Let me come to each of you with a question that really drills down on the things that you know very well, and then we'll open it to the audience. Senator Flake, the Republican Party, the grand old party, the party of free trade, the party of strong security, commitment to alliances, concern for not running a large deficit. What's happened? And I mean, and the question isn't just what's happened, but it's also, you know, one imagines that to get, if you accept the assumption that America is perhaps not on the course that many people wish it were, right. Wish it was. It's critical, I think many people feel, that the Republican Party plays an important role, a central role in holding firm to those commitments that it has held onto for quite a long time. It doesn't seem to be standing up at the moment. So can you give us some sense of whether there's likely to be an inflection point, and how are we to understand the current state of affairs in the Republican Party?
Well, we very much moved away from all of those items you talked about. That really animated the Republican Party for a long time. And even, you know, dating back to, you know, Barry Goldwater, who everybody kind of sees now because of the speech he gave about extremism as an extreme person. He at that time actually, along with William F. Buckley, kind of the intellectual head of the party, drove the Birchers out because they were prone to conspiracy theories and everything that the party now seems to be embracing. And so instead of having responsible people at the top divorcing those rogue elements, those rogue elements have taken over the party. And this is very much, as John Boehner said the other day in a moment of candor, former Speaker of the House, this is Donald Trump's party. And when you poll now in various states among Republican primary voters, where it used to be the most important issue was the economy or jobs or maybe immigration, depending on the state you're in. Now, in almost every state, the most important question to people is, are you with Trump? And so, you know, and that is, you know, 88–90% of the party are firmly with the president. And so it's not a commitment or fidelity to principle anymore. It's more of personality. And shirts versus skins. We're for him because the others are against him. So forcefully, our enemies are against him. And that, you know, where the inflection point is, I'm not sure. Usually a bad election certainly clarifies the census. After the election loss that we Republicans faced in 2012, after the Mitt Romney loss, we conducted an autopsy and concluded that as a party we needed to appeal to a broader electorate. The demographics were changing and we couldn't go on this way. But then a few months later we chased a populist. And so I'm not sure when that inflection point comes. It will ultimately, and this is what gives me optimism, resentment and anger are not governing philosophies. Mm-hmm. At some point you have to govern, and at some point the voters will again value that in a candidate or an elected official. So but as far as when that inflection point comes, I'm not sure.
John, when does that inflection point come, and what can we expect from the midterms?
Two different questions.
Well,
because the
you can take both of them.
The inflection point does not occur this year. I don't think if the midterm elections were today, Democrats would win and win big. We have plenty of evidence in special elections that that would be the case. Whether or not the enthusiasm of that Democratic electorate, which so far is pretty intense, the Obama coalition, winning coalition of 2008, 2012, seems to be, today, at least today, back together again. Democrats would win and win control of at least the House, possibly the Senate. But we have several more months to go, and countervailing there is the fact the economy is pretty good. Millennials who have only known recession and inability to get started in their professional lives are now getting back to work. So there are a number of factors. The inflection point will happen when millennials and Gen Z, and that includes all the subgroups of women and non-whites and so on that just are not being appealed to by the Republican Party, that inflection point. And I'm not sure that it will be the Democratic Party in the future. I think there will be a party realignment of some sort. When they become the majority of the electorate, those two demographic groups, then I think we'll see positive change.
For the commissioner, one of the things that came out in the presidential election, and it's not only an American phenomenon, but the divide between rural and urban areas, the divide in the United States between the megacities, 5 million plus, urban, suburban, and rural, very significant things. And so I was interested in what you said about New York City and your optimism and the dynamism taking place at the level of city and states. We hear this actually a lot in the UK and beyond, that this is where we need to look on the green, the question of the environment, and many other things. But there is, of course, this cynicism I'm sure that many people feel, which is, you're from New York City. I'm from New York City, too. I mean, New York is not, New York is not America. As significant as it is, and there's never any doubt about where New York is going on most of these issues, and certainly on the elections. So can you ground your optimism a little bit beyond New York City and perhaps a significant chunk of California and the mega cities?
I think I want to answer that in a few ways. One thing that is important to remember is that New York City, is sort of seen in this extra special place, but 40% of New Yorkers are born. And what we have done is show what it can look like to have an administration like the de Blasio administration, policies that celebrate diversity and inclusion. And that is something that goes completely against what we're hearing from the federal government. When we take on things like climate change, New York City was one of the first cities to sign on to the Paris Climate Accord after he had the U.S. withdraw from it. Up to 400 other U.S. cities have joined. That's not just New York City. Those are cities from all over the country, big and small. And what we have seen is there is, in this last year and a half, an opportunity to take leadership, city leadership. What does city diplomacy look like? What does it mean to build bridges with global communities, even as the federal government says no, right? Because if you're a small town, you still want to figure out how do you celebrate, support your immigrant communities, new businesses, tourism. There is such a value to having that connection to the international community. So I think New York City can play a role in largely showing what policy in particular can mean in this time that can celebrate the inclusion and the diversity of our communities.
Okay, I know the audience will come back to you on that, but Ambassador Gardner, you are in trade, tariffs. Things don't look good for Europe, and again, you have this perspective of the Americans and the Europeans on this. Do you think that there is a base, a significant base left in America that's in support of the European Union, that thinks that the way that things are going on trade and tariffs is not good? And is there any way to sort of effectively channel and foster that, or is this, America's perhaps, despite, what many people might think, America's always kind of been in it, hasn't been as interested in the European Union as many people might like to think, and perhaps when you put that together with the question of a new way of thinking about America having been taken advantage of on the trading order, that the entire relationship between the United States and the European Union is inevitably just going to continue to get worse?
Well, so I spent a lot of my time at Post in Brussels fighting not only for a transatlantic free trade agreement, but trying to explain and defend and promote free trade, on which the Republican Party has frankly been a lot better than the Democratic Party until now. And what we're seeing now, frankly, are a series of, I would consider, destructive policies that are born of short-term considerations, that play well to a narrow domestic base, which are not good for the country and certainly not good for the world and not good for trade, and born also of a series of profound misconceptions about the benefits of the rules-based international order, from which the United States has become rich and has benefited more, I would argue, than anyone else, and born also of a series of profound misunderstandings about the role and the utility as a partner of the European Union. Amongst other things, we should be working more than we've ever worked before, and we have done so for decades, with the EU on some of the issues which the President has correctly identified that need to be addressed. Unfair trading practices, not only by China, but others. And we should be doing so at the WTO within the context of this rules-based order. And what I find so profoundly sad is that we were doing so with great success. You know, there are a lot of things that are being said now that are simply untrue. We have won 91% of the cases we've brought at the WTO. Now, we've lost most of the ones brought against us, but we've won most of the ones that we've brought. We should be working with the EU more closely, and instead we're in this now context of emerging potential trade war, of tit-for-tat retaliations, and that will make us poorer. So I don't have the polling, and I haven't been a public servant, elected public servant, so I don't know how the Americans feel, but I remain convinced that free trade can be articulated in a better way, that people can understand. And at some point, I like to believe that all of our exporters, our exporting states, of which there are many, will understand that the logic of the policies on which we're now set are destructive of our own interests. And here I'll end, sorry. Just think of the single most important question: are these policies going to make us richer and better off? When we withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Agreement, the EU and Japan signed an agreement. The EU will be better placed than U.S. exporters than we are vis-a-vis the Japanese market, right? TPP went ahead without us, but minus the intellectual property protections and minus the investor-state dispute settlement provisions, which are important to defend investors in foreign markets. Now, I would like the administration to explain how any of that promotes our interests. And when TTIP is dead and the Canada-EU free trade agreement goes ahead, how on earth does that promote U.S. exporters' interests vis-a-vis the EU? It doesn't. It's destructive.
Before I open it up to the audience, Senator Flake, do you have a response to that? And I'm curious, with it amongst your colleagues, your Republican colleagues in the Senate, do they largely agree with what's just been said? And if they do agree, why do things look the way that they do right now?
One, they largely do agree, and he's right. With regard to free trade, Republicans have typically supplied about 80% of the votes needed to pass a trade promotion authority, for example, to give the president the authority to negotiate, and then to vote for the resulting trade deal. But typically what you had was, free trade is always more difficult to defend in a campaign. It's far easier to point to a shuttered factory and blame immigrants or a trade deal than it is to talk about trade, because it's a little more abstract on the campaign trail, 30-second sound bites. Now the difficulty is, in a campaign, people would not be so free trade-ish, but in the lame duck session, we'd come back and do what we had to do. And knowing that we needed to do it, even if you couldn't explain it on the campaign trail, you had enough responsible legislators to know, all right, let's get past the hurdle and then do it. And it's not just trade deals, but other things as well. For example, if we would have had the financial meltdown we had in 2008, could we today, would both of the both the president and the major candidate from the other party, if we were close to an election cycle, suspend their campaigns, get together, and encourage their party members to vote for TARP or something that would finish it. I'm not sure, and that's the difficulty right now. I think we'll eventually get back to that point, and free trade, obviously, when you look around the country now and look at what might happen when Europe retaliates, when Canada and Mexico inevitably do for these tariffs, then maybe enough people will see their own jobs at risk. But it's difficult. Free trade is always tough on the campaign trail, and I just, right now we're in a place where, although if you go around the table in a Republican Senate meeting, which we have just about every day at lunch, on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, almost to a person, they understand this. But they look and say, we've hitched our wagon to this horse. He's more popular than we are as an institution, and do we want to cross him here? And that's the calculation that's being made, and it's unfortunate, I think.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience. Hands held very high. If you say your name, state your intervention or question quite succinctly, and your affiliation would be great. Right here in the towards the back, right there, exactly.
Hi, I'm Christina Lunz, Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. I guess I would like to stress that I personally don't, and I think we shouldn't feel comfortable with the idea of adjusting to what is happening in the US, not in America, but in the US. And I'm also saying that, I guess as a German, and I feel the importance that we need to constantly resist towards what is happening in the US. Looking at the early signs of fascism, we see many of them in the US, and we've seen them for 1.5 years, and we are beyond the early stages, including attacks on institutions and media, misogynist and toxic masculine behavior, and focus on militarized power and acting outside the law, and many others. So I would appreciate also if we had more conversation on human rights and the human rights atrocities that are happening in the country, including the Muslim ban and stealing children and abusing women, and not focus on tariffs all the time, and have a stronger, more resisting conversation about the US.
Thank you, important question. I'm going to collect a few and expect not everybody to answer every question, so hone in on the one that you'd really like to respond to. We had a question here from, again, if you say who you are, and
Hans Kandanani from Chatham House. I wanted to come back to this question of the realignment in American politics, and I guess this is particularly for John and Senator Flake. How exactly do you envisage this realignment happening at the tipping point that you talked about? Are we talking simply about the Republicans kind of coming to their senses and going back to that 2012 moment, reaching out to Hispanics, re-embracing free trade, and so on? Or are we talking about, a new centrist party, a third party kind of emerging to fill this space that you've described as being sort of vacated in the center ground of American politics? And also, are the sort of battles in American politics, the issues on which they're being fought, shifting? So I've heard a lot of people speculate about, given the way that both the Democrats and the Republicans are split internally on these economic issues around free trade, that essentially what you happen, and some people would argue this is already happening, you essentially have two parties fighting out purely on these cultural questions. So you have the culture wars basically playing out between Democrats and Republicans. So in other words, what exactly does this realignment look like when it takes place?
okay, I'm going to take two more and then come back to the panel. We had a gentleman here. Right there, yeah, exactly.
Al Hamiza SOAS and Oxford University. A question for John. I'm slightly more familiar with your great polling on MENA as a MENA watcher, but I'd like to put a question forward on the US. I'd appreciate if you could give us a little bit on if you like, a breakdown or profiling of the approval ratings for Trump versus, say, an Obama. Of course, different eras, different circumstances, but whether it be Central Lakes, East, South, and I'd also appreciate if you could say a little bit on where minorities stand in terms of their approval rating. And I know you're not into the game of forecasting proper, but if you could humor us and entertain us, and perhaps from those you've polled, who is most likely to compete with the gentleman in 2020? A Biden, a Harris, a Warren? Please, thank you.
Okay, I think I'll pause actually with those three.
Oprah as well.
We have several more, but I don't want these three because they're quite substantial to get lost.
So
go ahead.
Question.
Yes, please.
I appreciate that question. You know, it is difficult to be an American right now, and one of something that we're doing in New York City, and this also gets to the question you asked about smaller cities around the U.S. Yesterday, a number of mayors went to a Texas border town. This was a bipartisan group, small, big cities, but at the end of the day, they are coalescing as collectives to increase their power around issues related to, in this case, in terms of immigration. What we are doing in New York City is we are what we like to colloquially, whatever, I can't say it, in this moment, we're doubling down. So how are we expanding and increasing resources for our human rights program? And we have policies like IDNYC, which we invite all residents of New York City, irrespective of their documentation status, to get this identification card so that they can access services. That includes picking their kids up from school, medical services, whatever they need from the city. And these are the kinds of things that we are trying to spearhead in New York City, and then see from a policy perspective who can replicate them. Paris created a version of that. There are other cities around the US that have done a version of IDNYC. And so there is such an opportunity to be a hub, because at the city and state level where we are connected to the communities. So we can talk about what the federal government is doing from this 10,000-foot perspective of policy, but it's the communities that are actually fearful. We have children that don't want to show up to school. We have families that don't want to take their kids to the hospital or get services that they need. How do you serve them? That is the reason that cities matter in this conversation, because we're the ones that are dealing with the implications of all of these other very important policies, but we're living the reality. So what New York City is doing is expanding and reallocating resources to ensure that human rights, gender rights are top of priority.
Are those cities across the sort of red-blue divide, or
yes.
Okay?
And it's and in the U.S. it's largely organized around the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which has partisan breaks. But at the end of the day, there are a number of topics like climate, like this issue with the families being separated at the border, where they come together. Senator,
I think you had one of these.
Most of that was John. So, but I'll take. What does the realignment look like? There's that old saw that running as an independent is the future, and it will always be the future. You don't know at what point you get there. I do think that for the foreseeable future, it's going to be Republicans or Democrats, and I'm just hoping that we can get back to a point where voters value a party that can govern, and we've seen kind of pendulum swings. Maybe a charismatic leader to more of a technocrat. You see that in other countries as well. Maybe, I don't know how long that takes, how many cycles that takes, but I'm hopeful that in this next cycle, at least somebody runs on the Republican side to remind Republicans what Republicans typically stand for, used to stand for, can and have to stand for again. And the realignment, I think it has to be along more traditional lines, but with an emphasis on actually being able to govern.
John?
Yeah, I'm going to try to tackle both of those questions at the same time. There's so much to say. I'm going to try to be succinct. For starters, in terms of the realignment, I don't see it being along Democrat and Republican lines. I think those models have burned themselves out. I also think that the liberal versus conservative dichotomy has burned itself out. And here's where I'm getting into specifically millennials and younger. I think the conversation of the now and the future is more libertarian versus communitarian. And that's where I see what I see millennials ushering in. Two softer ideologies that intersect at various points a whole lot better than the left and the right traditionally have. In terms of party, I think we're looking at a structural revolution as well. The thing I know about millennials and now Gen Z is that they're not hierarchical. They don't trust a pecking order. They're horizontal. They network. When it comes to problem solving, there is very little patience in the old party model of moving it up the chain or waiting for cautious deliberation. There's a sense of immediacy. And I think the thing to watch that may be driving that, and this is something we may see in November, the Parkland students. An entire generation now of kids who know nothing but school shooting. I think that the Parkland shooting is the Pearl Harbor of Generation Z and younger millennials. This is the kind of the formative moment for them. This drives home everything that is wrong with the current system. Now, in terms of Adel's question in the back, if the election were held today, I think it's a blue wave. I think all the evidence points to that. The election is not today. There's several more months, and while we've spent some time talking about the real problems within the GOP, I think in the ambulance next to the GOP on a race course to the hospital dead on arrival is the Democratic Party as well. And so never underestimate their capacity to screw themselves up. There are real structural and personality and ideological problems on the Democratic side. And that's the very thing that could keep young people home. And look, when I'm talking about young people, I'm not talking about an interesting, intriguing group of young folks. We're talking about close to 45, 46% of the electorate if they all turn out. It is very important. If 2018 is indeed their moment, you'll see a blue wave. I'm not convinced entirely yet.
Senator Flake, let me come back to you just very briefly on this Parkland question. Do you yourself, or does the Republican Party take Parkland seriously? Do you think it will lead to any rethinking of the sort of party position or individual senators' positions?
I don't think it's been taken seriously enough, certainly. On that issue, I do think that younger people, what John said about it defining everything that's wrong with Congress, not being able to move forward on consensus items. You know, should somebody who's denied the ability to purchase a handgun, should they be able, at age 18 to 21, should they be able to buy an assault weapon? You know, things like that. That's kind of a no-brainer, but we couldn't even get that. You know, I do think that is an issue that Republicans, we are avoiding at our peril, dismissing that and just looking, can we get past the next election, and not looking at demographics and what that's going to do. So, yeah, I do think it's a problem. And
does it just come down, because I think the sort of one-liner that people in the UK assume that it's just, well, three initials, the NRA. I mean, is it a more complex story, or is it really as direct as that?
It's not. I wouldn't put it precisely with the NRA, but with that group, or those who are excited to vote, those who hand out leaflets for you, those who make calls. The energy of the base of the Republican Party are those who simply look at this as another attempt by the left to take over our way of life. And so it's not as simple as the NRA as it is just kind of the feeling that there they are, out to get us again, out to, you know, it's red America rising up and saying that the coasts aren't going to govern us. And so that's just where I see it, and I think that's at our peril.
Ambassador, did you want to come in on some of these questions? You have a quick two-finger on the NRA question?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, just really quickly, here is what you need to watch. When school goes back in session in August and early September, if high school kids throughout the United States stay home the first or second, third days of school, you'll get your clue as to what's happening in November.
Okay. Ambassador, did you want to respond to any of these, or?
The first question I wanted to come back to, right, the one that was asked about values, because I think it's very important. I think this is or could be a wake-up call to a lot of us. Look, I grew up as an American thinking there's certain things that could never happen in the United States. There are only things that could happen in so-called developing countries. Those things are now happening in the United States, and a lot of people are worried about it. But let's remember, it's a phenomenon and not just in the United States. It's now shared in many countries of the world. It's a global phenomenon. We're seeing similar things happening in Turkey and in Hungary and in Poland and in other countries. And I think that there are people who are concerned about it, and that we will rediscover the values that we once believed were important. For example, the use of soft power, the use of our image around the world, which was such an important tool of ours in terms of our foreign policy. And a lot of anecdotes, but one sticks out in my mind. Before I went to post, I went down to Tampa, Florida, which is the headquarters of the Joint Special Operations Command. And we were given briefing by a tall, very imposing general who was leading the JSOC. And he said something that was remarkable. He said, if I could take $1 billion out of my budget and give it to the State Department, I would. But I can't, because Congress doesn't trust people like you in suit and ties as much as it trusts people like me in uniform. But I believe, he said, in the power of soft power, because I know if you don't do what you do, we will pay the price multiplied manyfold downstream in terms of loss of treasure and loss of lives. So I think those things are going to come back. I think that we tend to exaggerate the extremes. You know, just like before the election, everyone was assuming that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Now a lot of people seem to be assuming he's going to get a second term. I don't think we should assume anything. I think those values will come back.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the audience. And could I encourage you, when you say your affiliation, if you could choose the one that's relevant to this panel in addition, because I know that not everybody knows each other, and it helps the panelists to understand the part of your background that might be especially relevant to them. The gentleman here in the front. The mic here in the front.
Jeremy Greenstock, former British diplomat and chairman of a geopolitical advisory company. I think what concerns the European side of observing this discussion amongst Americans is that what tends to come out of American democratic evolution is going to hit us a decade or less down the line. And there are fundamental things going wrong with democracy, or what we expect out of democracy, one of which is the expectation that democracy gives us increasing amounts of freedom all the time on a line going up forever. But in the title of this session is the word balance. Where's the balance going to come back? Because the gap between where society wants to go in its various different emanations and the capacity of traditional politics to meet those society expectations is growing as a gap. Mm-hmm. And I don't see a realignment coming either by traditional means or, John, by non-traditional means. It's more of an evolution of things happening because democracy allows resentment and anger, which are not governing philosophies, to elect leaders who don't necessarily have governing philosophies that make rational sense against policy-making criteria. So there's an experiment going on with where democracy is going, and it needs a new form of leadership or another voice to bring us back to centralist reality about where policy making and governing in the best sense actually produces the answer that we're looking for. Can you see that coming out of the American system? Because if you can't see it coming out of the American system, we too are heading in a difficult direction.
And can you remind me which years you were ambassador in Washington?
I was in New York, 98 to 2003, not in Washington. I was deputy in Washington in the mid-90s.
I'm just back here.
Thanks. Patricia Lewis from Chatham House International Security Department. And I used to live in the United States, so I guess I moved to the United States just before President Obama got elected. So I guess that's where this is coming from. So I've got two quick questions. So if President Trump leaves office for some reason, God forbid, becomes unable to govern for some reason, would a US under President Mike Pence be any different? So that's the first one. The second one is, how would you advise people to behave when President Trump makes his first presidential visit to the UK in a few weeks?
Okay, now we're getting to the heart of things. In the front row, and then we'll come just back here in red.
Hello, I'm Tangi Morgan. I'm American, and I am a senior advisor to the Bank of England, so that is where I'm coming from on this. I find it very upsetting, as someone who advises boards on governance, accountability, that we really have a president of the United States that is being held to a lesser standard than chairs and chairmen and CEOs of major corporations. And throughout this conference, we've talked about governance and structure and trust and all of this. I mean, how can the Republicans or Democrats, whoever, sit there and actually see such malfeasance? Typically, if this was a boardroom, the CEO would not be there. And I'm just curious as to how you sleep at night and let this continue to go on. Second question, New York. I know that the Attorney General in New York has now set forth pursuit of the Trump Foundation using monies to fund several political events, and I'm just wondering if you have some updates on that.
We had a question right back here. Exactly, yes.
Hello, I'm Vlad Galushka from the Open Society Foundations. So my question is twofold. I want to follow up on the point from Ambassador Gardner on soft power. Obviously, the current period will have huge implications on American soft power. How do you see what is going to be left of it at the end of this period? How can America regain its soft power? And the second point, I mean, the absence of America is acutely felt in many regions where I cover for my work, in particular the post-Soviet space, the Western Balkans. There are very, very few voices now in America, Senator McCain being one of them, who are trying to let these places know that they remain on the American radar, that they're not going to be thrown under the bus. What can be done in the meantime? That's the question.
Okay, we will come right back to the audience, but I think we'll take a moment for the panel. Did you want to start with that last question, maybe? I know you.
Yeah. On that one. In fact, I do think it's important. One thing I enjoyed about John McCain being in the Senate, and a lot of things I enjoyed about John. I'm typically just known as the other senator from Arizona, and that's fine with me. But was traveling with John around the world. It was always an experience. Everybody knew him, but he felt it as his role even then, and certainly more important now, to let our allies in particular know that we are still allies, that this will pass, and that we remain friends. I'll be leading a delegation to Scandinavia next week for this purpose, to make sure that those countries, particularly those in NATO, with NATO exercises coming up, and with Russian, interference and aggression, that we're there. It is important. We took a trip to Africa, to Niger, to Burkina Faso, countries that we're working in and helping, down to Zimbabwe and South Africa and Namibia. we need to make sure that is important. And let me just say on soft power, I have one anecdote, and Ambassador Gardner is completely right. Just in Africa, I chair the Africa subcommittee and spent time in the 1980s in Southern Africa, part of my time in Zimbabwe there. I wrote my master's thesis trying to figure out Mugabe's hold on to power at the end of the 80s. And he went on a long time after that. But 2 years ago, we were in Zimbabwe, a delegation of 5 senators, and he wanted to meet with us, Mugabe did, and so we sat down to about a 4-hour-long diatribe in the middle of the night, where he went after, it started with the Lancaster House Accords in 1980 and then went on to just rail against every American president and British prime minister there was, and he finally got to George W. Bush and going after him, and I thought, I've had about enough here. I said, wait a second. PEPFAR was the George W. Bush initiative in Africa, and it really helped Zimbabwe out, didn't it? And he stopped for a minute, I'll never forget it, and he said, you got me there. He said, and I never thought I would hear that from one of the longest dictators in Africa. The impact of soft power, that program and many others have not only alleviated a lot of human suffering and helped those countries in that way, but have also led to better relationships that we need on security issues and other things. So I completely agree on that's been more important the longer I've been in Congress to see the importance of soft power.
Ambassador Gardner, some of those were directly for you questions. Would you like to?
Well, about Trump's visit to London, I think it would be only appropriate to greet him, respectfully. He is our president of the United States. And he is, the United States will remain a very important, a key partner of the United Kingdom. I think it would be only correct, however, for this government to voice its concerns about a number of issues, which it has done, and in some cases actually appear to have changed his mind. I'll give you one example. When the Prime Minister was in Washington, apparently Oval Office, she said to him that the United States, Washington, should not be militating, cheerleading for a breakup of the European Union, because the UK believes that a cohesive, integrated, successful European Union, 27, is also in the interests of the United Kingdom. And apparently he said, really? You don't think that it'd be a good thing for there to be multiple Brexits? And apparently the answer was no. So that's an example, but I think there are others in which she hopefully will try, perhaps not successfully, to say the importance of free trade, importance of cohesion toward Russia. Just one other thing, on the issue of, on soft power, let's remember that on this issue, I think there's been remarkable unity amongst the Republicans and Democrats for decades. We've really agreed on much, much more than we've disagreed. I saw personally how we were working effectively with the European Union in the Balkans, right? And now I would argue the United States withdrawing has left a vacuum. The EU is valiantly trying to stand up for the things that we were working for, anti-corruption, good governance, and so forth, but it's going to be very difficult for the EU to do it alone. No doubt it's difficult for us to be preaching, which we will be if there's a change of administration, preaching for good governance, anti-corruption, when we do not respect those values at home. So our brand image, no doubt, will be harmed in the coming years, but I think we can return to the sense of consensus that we had domestically.
Please.
Yeah, both questions. I think we've focused so much on the belief in democracy that we have not been prepared for the ugly side of what happens when there is democracy. Hamas wins in Gaza, Morsi wins in Egypt. You are so correct that with democracy has to come not only governance, but the ability to govern, but also the ability to deal with probably the fundamental economic issue in the world, which is economic inequality. That's ultimately what led to the perfect storm that got Donald Trump elected. It's an ugly moment in the United States, but it's not America. And so what happens? Intensity wins. The victory of Donald Trump is nothing more nor nothing less than a death rattle of an older, whiter, angrier, forgotten America. He had the very good fortune to run against someone who was damaged. On day one, Hillary Clinton, 36% said that they trust her to tell the truth. On election day, 36% said that they trust her to tell the truth. He ran an anti-establishment campaign against the epitome of the establishment. Let's not for a second think that there was any misogyny here whatsoever. There are 10 reasons to love and hate Hillary Clinton before you even get to woman. She ran on her own. With that all said, this is temporary. There is an antidote. There are younger voters that don't have any patience for any of this kind of behavior whatsoever. And with that said, it's a question now, are they going to vote? If they do, we're okay.
Henny.
Yes. So I'm going to politely disagree with Ambassador Gardner. And if you are not in government, Americans love to protest. And I encourage that if you are not in government, welcoming the President of the United States in a very diplomatic way. If you disagree with his policies that you see both in the US and abroad, I say protest. And your question regarding potential President Pence is really interesting. You know, I sit at the UN. I'm the commissioner. I run the agency that deals with the largest diplomatic corps in the world. And so I work very closely with the State Department and counterparts at the US mission to the UN. And one of the observations that I've had in this very unique role is that, you know, this administration doesn't believe in the fundamental functionality of government. And what is happening, people aren't getting hired, people are leaving, and we are losing human capital that is long-term going to undermine our institutions that are well beyond this 4-year term or 8-year term. And one of my real concerns where I sit politically of a President Pence is that that is going to continue, whether it's at the EPA, whether it's at the State Department, whatever the institution is. And to me, that is a real concern. And to my fellow American on the front row, I could not agree with you more on governance. I am more compliant as a commissioner than apparently the president is. The Attorney General is taking that very seriously. I don't have any public updates to share, but that is something that is also, you know, again, what's happening at the state level, and another example of where cities and states are taking a leadership role.
Okay, we're going to have one more round of questions. If you keep them fairly succinct, I'm going to take many, and you're not going to get an answer, but we will give everybody on the panel a final closing comment. But I'll start over here in the front row, please. And if you say who you are and what your relevant affiliation is for the panel.
Harriet Leslie, Chatham House, but I was also British ambassador to NATO until about 4 years ago. I wanted, therefore, to touch on hard power as well as soft power, because arguably it's the unique US combination of soft and hard power that has made it the normative power for the world. And it's that shakiness on both fronts that is proving very, very disruptive to its allies, but also to its opponents elsewhere. So my question really goes to Generation Z and the millennials. NATO, dare I say it, is an incredibly good deal for the US. It's a one-stop shop where it gets 28 other countries in the same room, week in, week out, throughout the year. It's got all of its defense budgets transparent, aligned to US made in America concepts of military doctrine. It's got defense markets. It's got allies who are there with it, giving it legitimacy and diplomatic cover in theaters as far apart as Syria and Afghanistan. And calling all that into question is actually a really bad deal for the US. So my question is, do the millennials and Generation Z get that, or is that concept of hard power just not something that is among their priorities?
Okay, in this section, just here.
István Hegedűs from the Hungarian Europe Society, a former liberal member of the Hungarian parliament. My question is about realignment on the international level. What if President Trump might realize that he has some potential allies like populist leaders, politicians inside the European Union, like my Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who has not been yet invited to the White House. What if there is a negative scenario regarding European elections, European Parliament elections next year, and populists might become stronger inside the EU? Do you think that Trump might start to be part of a new populist international at international level? Thank you.
Just right here, the gentleman, yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leslie. My name is Ahmed Isak from Kenya. Just a general question to all the panelists. You had your elections in 2016, and there was allegations of hacking of the elections, influenced by other parties in the elections. You are going to have the midterm elections. Have there been any lessons learned? Are you worried about those potential threats again? Thank you.
And just behind, right here, and yeah, exactly.
Hello, my name is Angela Schlater. I'm a program officer at the MacArthur Foundation. I'm a U.S. citizen. You can probably tell from my accent. I want to go back to the beginning when the ambassador mentioned the attacks on institutions. And what I'm sensing from the panel is that the United States is in we have to wait for a return to the ability of governing. But can our institutions withstand the continuing attacks with the flood of human capital out of the institutions? And to John, you had mentioned that your hope is Gen Z and the millennials, but yet the inflection point at which they will rise up is not now. So where do we go from here? Do we just sit and wait? I mean, what can we do? Or, what about the institution?
Easy questions, and we're not going to get answers. I'm going to take a few more over here. Please, one question, very, very succinct. Right at the back, because you've had your hand up for quite a long time. Right at the back in this section. Right there, exactly, yes.
Hi, my name is Jerzy Wurman.
Louder, please.
My relevant affiliation for the panel is that I come from the most pro-American country, that is Albania. I have only a brief comment. The commissioner said that it's difficult to be an American these days. Actually, I think it's difficult to be an American that has to justify or be more elegant about certain policies these days, including family separation. And to the ambassador, it's not the same to say that these policies are happening also in some other countries like Hungary and Poland or Turkey, because it's not the same. The people's perception and people's expectation from the US, it's not comparable. Thank you.
Okay, 1, 2, front row, and then right behind in the second row, and then here, and then we're done.
So, Tricia de Borgrav, I'm a writer, and I have written on a bit of what's been going on in our country. I'm American. The fascinating thing about having a character like Trump and his lying qualities, and well, they're not qualities, his lies, and his hypocrisies, is that it does actually flag up the inconsistencies and deficiencies in any political system. Mm. Is there an appetite from politicians, American politicians today, to really look at their own campaign funding? Everyone is looking that way. Students at Parkland are making those connections between how you're being funded. And I think that is the key to if you're going to rise above all this right now.
Just behind you. And nice and succinct, please.
Philippe de Wapantanach, Standard Chartered Bank. This question is for Senator Flake. It's going to be very concrete. For bankers and investors on global financial markets, one of the biggest worry right now is trade war initiated by Trump. Do you think, one, that Trump is only campaigning and things could change after the midterms? And second, building on what you said before on the senator and maybe other congressman calculation, do you think that if they lose the majority, if the Republicans lose the majority, this calculation could change and they could try to stifle Trump's policies on this?
And then right here in the front row.
Hello, Jelena Milic, Center for Atlantic Studies, Serbia, Western Balkans. Small intervention. I think all things being considered, Western Balkans as well as Ukraine are pretty happy so far with the appointment of Assistant Secretary of the State, Mr. Wes Mitchell. You know, he is paying attention to increasing Russian influence, you know, which is kind of known in Ukraine and this part of the world, but is really happening in my part of the world as well. But I can't resist. I have to ask Madam Commissioner one personal question. Do you by any chance watch TV show Billions?
Billions?
Billions TV show.
Yes,
I'm going to let you come back to that. Was there a tag on that? Because did you say, do you watch it?
Just ask if you are watching a very popular TV show that's happening in New York called Billions.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Is there anybody here that has their hand up and has not spoken throughout the entire conference? That hasn't said anything? Okay, there we go, right there, and then we'll stop. Unless somebody like Bernice tells me where else I need to go. No, anywhere else? Okay.
Delane
yeah,
Swenson.
Need to go. No.
I'm a law professor in Poland. I'm an American who's lived in Europe for 21 years. I'm a sort of dying breed. I'm a moderate Republican. And unfortunately, moderates are not popular in either political system. But I am going to do something that probably will get me killed in the next 10 minutes, and I'm going to disagree a little bit.
As long as it's very succinct, because my director has just given me the...
with sort of groupthink that everything that Trump does is bad, or it's all his fault, or... the truth is that a lot of my relatives in the Midwest voted for Trump because there is a long history of the intellectual elites in America talking down about them. And we saw a good example today. Right? The commissioner said New York and California coast is the sane part of America. Well, you basically just called all those people who voted for Trump insane. And they hear that, right? And the fear that I have, because I'm not a Trump supporter, is that not learning the lesson of the 2016 election, the Democratic Party will continue to alienate those voters. And that's one of the reasons why they're rallying to Trump's side. So there's blame here, not all at Trump's feet. So I think it's time for everybody to acknowledge that there are some bigger issues.
Thank you. Very important intervention. Okay. I'm sorry. 1 minute. I'm going to start with you. Far end.
Far end. Okay, lightning round. Gen Z and millennials are people to people. They see Russians, they see Ukrainians, they see everybody as just like me. Very little concept of the other. They don't think yet in terms of hard power military. Somebody else.
Only 1 minute.
Oh, only 1 minute.
So 30 seconds left.
Money is a perversion in American politics. Real quick, I got a call once from the majority leader of the Senate, raising money, saying to me, we need the best possible polling this year. This is 2006. Can I count on you for $25,000? I said, to hire me? He said, oh no, to hire one of our pollsters. That's a perversion.
Ambassador Gardner.
Okay, just 2 points. I think there was a question about the realignment at international level. We saw recently the U.S. ambassador to Berlin openly say that one of the things the United States should be doing is to empower conservative movements around Europe. Now that's an extraordinary statement. I don't know if any other ambassador would have seen in his job description to go around empowering political parties of one persuasion or another. But I don't think he's alone. I think probably this White House does see that it is important to reach out to other countries. I would assume that John Bolton probably agrees with this. Certainly Steve Bannon has been doing a tour around Europe in which he's openly saying we're allied with certain movements around Europe and we should band together. There was another question about the outflow of talent from institutions. Look, I think the State Department is a real issue. They've lost a lot of good people. It won't be easy to replace them. There's going to be a whole layer of management that will have been gone. Fewer people are applying. I think that could be a long-term problem. But in terms of the courts and the media, I think there we can rest more assured because subscription rates for quality media are shooting up and the courts are so far functioning.
Commissioner.
So to clarify on the point that I made about the beacon of sanity, I was not talking about the individuals that are in these two coasts, but it was rather the policies. So one thing that in the city that we're trying to do is show leadership around climate change in particular. We felt it after Superstorm Sandy, where we had about 70 New Yorkers killed. And what we've decided to do is invest and focus on something called climate accountability. We've divested our pension funds from the major fossil fuel companies, and we are also in the process of suing them over the damage that happened during Superstorm Sandy. So when it comes to climate accountability, when it comes to how we are inclusive and we celebrate our diversity in the way that we welcome our immigrant populations, these are things that I personally believe strengthen the United States. And so in terms of a beacon of sanity, I mean it by the policy leadership that cities can show and what we can share throughout the country, no matter whether they are big or small or rural or suburban.
Thank you. And final comment from you, remarks from you, Senator Flake.
Sure, just to address the one, will our institutions hold? I do think the judiciary has been stellar thus far. They have held. People have recused themselves when they should recuse themselves. People like Bob Mueller are pushing on ahead regardless of the sound around him. And the courts are doing the right thing, so that's holding. The press as well, particularly the print media. Sometimes cable shows get a little, they feed into the president's caricature too much and makes it too easy to get demagogue on the other side, but the press is holding. And I would submit that when somebody reflexively refers to the media as fake news, it's that person who should be held in suspicion, not the media or not the press. And it is very damaging around the world. It's not just words, but when you refer to the press as the enemy of the people, you should know that that phrase has an ignoble pedigree, and our president should know better than that. But the press has held well. Where I'm more concerned about is Congress. The real separation of powers, that Article 1 branch. I'm not sure that we have pushed back as we should have, particularly on trade, where we know better, to a person on the Republican side and almost to a person on all sides. We all know what we need to do in the value of trade, yet we can't get a vote on the floor to show that we push back. And we ought to be doing our job there. We shouldn't start every discussion about proposing legislation as, will the president support it? That's not our job. Our job is to pass legislation. His job is to veto it or sign it. And so I'm fearing that in terms of institutions standing up, Congress has been far more supine than we should be.
Thank you. And thank you to all of the panelists. And please join me in thanking all of them and all of you.